He held my grandfather's passbook over a bucket of melting ice and champagne like a magician about to reveal the trick. Only his trick was humiliation. The room was full of clinking glasses and someone laughing at a joke that hadn't landed. My dress was new, my hair pinned up, the crowd leaning forward because weddings make people greedy for spectacle. He called the yellowed paper trash and let it slip from his fingers. It fell into the bucket and disappeared under shards of clear, fizzing cold. For a second, everything slowed. The glitter of sequins, the slow sinking of paper, my father's grin that had grown harder with years. I dove, my dress snagged on the rim, lace tearing. My fingers went numb in the champagne. The passbook was soggy, pages stuck together, the ink blurred. I dragged it out like I was pulling someone alive from water. They clapped, sympathetic, mocking, and Richard, my father, laughed like it had been a joke all along. He thrust the ruined book toward me as if I should be grateful. I remember the heat at the base of my skull that had lived in me for as long as I could remember. The specific smallness he trained in me with words and looks. That thing was nothing, he said. Samuel left it to the house, not to girls who clean up after other people. I had learned early how to fold myself small and be useful. Clean the spills, smooth the plates, accept the backhanded compliment, disappear into a role. I was 40 when my grandfather died, a trauma nurse by trade, used to seeing people at their worst and doing the steady work afterward. I had always been the person who fixed the immediate problem. That night I fixed my face into a polite smile and left with a wet passbook in my purse and a dress with a ragged hem. 3 days later, it smelled like lacquer and marble in the bank. The lobby swallowed sound, a cathedral of glass and polished stone. I told the teller I had an account question. She had the careful kindness of someone who'd been taught not to let her voice rise. Her fingers were quick on the keyboard. After a quiet back and forth, she looked up at me with something like disbelief. "Ma'am, this isn't a regular savings account," she said. "This is a tartan, payable on death. It was seeded decades ago. It's worth 12.4 million. Tartan Trust." The banker's one-line explanation: a form of account where the original owner names a beneficiary to receive the funds when they die. No probate, directly payable. The passbook was proof of who Samuel had intended it for. 12 million sounded almost obscene in a place where the clerk's name tags matched the soft economy of polite deceit. For 1 second I felt the room disappear, and then the childhood light behind my eyes flipped on. Flashes of my mother's folded linens, my father's cold little rules, the way his voice could make me stop mid-sentence and apologize for taking up air. The branch manager, later described to me by name, a regional director wearing a suit that made him look like the bank itself, brought me into a private room and closed the door. He said the number again slowly as if letting it land, $12,400,000. He explained the paperwork, the beneficiary designation in the passbook, and asked the kind of questions people ask when they're trying to be professional and humane at once. "Do you have legal counsel?" he asked. I didn't. My head filled with memories. Samuel teaching me to read the ledger, his voice low about small things being important, the way he'd fold that passbook into a drawer and smile at me like we were in on a safe private joke. I thought about Richard holding that book like theater and tossing it as though it were worthless. The number on the bank slip didn't just mean safety. It had the weight of change. What had been presented as a dented, yellowed scrap in a bucket at my wedding was suddenly a legal instrument of decades of intent. The power dynamic in my family, which had always been skewed in Richard's favor by showmanship and intimidation, shifted on the publication of that figure. When I walked back out into the daylight, the world seemed thinner at the edges. I called Luke. Luke is a calm person in a way that feels engineered for emergencies. Measured, inquisitive, the sort of mind that bookmarks the margins of paper with questions. He is also my husband. He sat at the kitchen table with the passbook between his palms, and the tendency he has for detail that usually annoys me. That night it was the kind of focus I would have prayed for as a child. He took the bank's photocopy and started following the faint traces that lead to the truth of money. Statements, transfers, odd withdrawals that didn't match what a man at retirement age would spend. He was not a lawyer. He was a forensic analyst by temperament, good with patterns, with accounting oddities. He fed data into spreadsheets in a way that made the numbers tell a story. What he found made the house feel suddenly colder. Richard, it turned out, had been living on borrowed liquidity for years. There were shell accounts, empty wards where cash had been shuffled in ways that made the books look full if you only glanced. Foreclosure notices lined up against properties he had once boasted about. Old clients who had paid and not been paid. A cascade of promises. Worst of all, an IRS notice tucked into a PDF server he had apparently ignored. Substantial discrepancies flagged. Penalties threatened. It looked like a Ponzi-like pattern. Money appearing to cover prior obligations, shuffled to look like solvency. I won't claim the technical precision of a prosecutor. I'm a nurse. But I learned how to read evidence as a life or death clinician reads a chart. The pattern wasn't complicated. There was scarcity masked by motion, a constant need for new money to feed old claims, and in private conversations, when his patience for my curiosity ran thin, Richard's voice turned from performative to dangerous. "That money will ruin you if you touch it," he said once over dinner, swirling his wine the way men do when testing a story. "You don't know what you're dealing with, Alyssa. Don't mess with family." "Give it to me," he demanded when I told him what the bank had said. "Give me the passbook. You don't even know how to manage that. I'll shelter it in the trust. I'll protect the family." I heard the same old script beneath the new syllables. Overprotection as control, generosity posed as a theft of choice. He began to talk about litigation and elders' rights, and how a daughter who had been taking things could be accused of undue influence. He mentioned reputational risk, as if the only thing worth conserving was his own story. That's when Luke and I stopped pretending we were not at stake. Whatever the passbook promised, security, the cottage Samuel had kept, some final justice for a life of small mercies, it was also evidence. It proved Samuel's intent. It contradicted the story Richard had been selling for years, that the family's assets were modest, that everything had to flow through his stewardship. We spoke to a lawyer because there is a limit to what two people with a laptop and righteous anger should do alone. With counsel, we filed a complaint outlining suspicious transfers and attaching affidavits and copies of the passbook. We learned how slow and meticulous the law is, but we also learned that systems exist to collect facts and do something with them. There was a plan that formed like a seam under our conversation, part legal, part theatrical. I still remember the queasy ethical knot in my stomach when it did. Richard was built to perform. He craved an audience, a stage to preen and rewrite his image. If he loved spectacle, we could give him one, on our terms. The idea wasn't to entrap illegally or to commit fraud. It was to set a situation where his own hunger for public recognition would produce the evidence we already had, and the law needed to act. We prepared for a public confrontation because he insisted on public triumph. He was arranging a gala to announce an expansion of his family's foundation, a loyal audience of donors, a bank of lights, a press table. He spoke of how he would dedicate the cottage to Samuel's name. He wanted applause. We decided to give it to him while placing discreetly and legally a mirror in the place where he would step. We made two parallel preparations. The first was the decoy, documents and a presentation folder that matched what he wanted to sign, clean, official-looking, the kind of theatrical paperwork a man like him would adore. I want to be very clear here. The decoy documents were not used to steal, launder, or redirect funds. They were designed to match Richard's assumptions, so he would move publicly in a way that recorded his intentions in front of witnesses. The second was the real legal work. A whistleblower filing, filed with counsel, supported by affidavits and the bank documentation we had been granted, to the appropriate federal authorities. That complaint initiated the chain that would prompt civil enforcement and, if warranted, criminal investigation. We did not and would not attempt to take money ourselves. The only aim was to precipitate lawful scrutiny using his performance against him. Those moments were built out of a complicated moral calculus. I spent nights awake thinking about whether reducing my father to a mark was any better than the violence he practiced. I was not blind to the sway of revenge. I was weary of the years in which my voice carried nothing. But the choice was also between litigation and letting him keep a narrative that put him in control. I had been raised to disappear. I had also been taught by Samuel that legacy is a responsibility. The passbook wasn't a reward for cleverness. It was an obligation. If I could turn it into protection for the people who really needed it, my little nephew, the women who worked for the cottage, the nurse visiting program Samuel had quietly funded, then it was worth the discomfort. On the night of the gala, I wore red. People remember the color as if it explains everything, bold, conspicuous. I chose red because for years I had hid behind neutrality. For a single night, I would not ask permission to be seen. The ballroom was a sea of chandeliers and silk. Richard moved through it like a man who'd always believed that presence equated to power. He took the podium and spoke in that practiced cadence of a patriarch who has never been challenged publicly. His words were polished and false. He announced the foundation expansion amid applause, the camera lights catching his smile. He invited me up to present the check. I stepped into the light with the passbook folded in my clutch. He wanted witnesses. He wanted applause to seal his narrative that he was the family's savior. He signed the documents we had given him, the decoy agreements that looked right to him, and crucially, included signature pages attached to the public account side of the presentation. He put his flourish on the paper in full view. I snapped a photo. I clicked once and sent it to counsel, and directly to the DOJ email our lawyer had provided for the complaint. I did not fabricate anything there. I simply transmitted evidence, his signature on a document drafted by him, to transfer control under public declarations that contradicted the facts his accounts had shown. Those elements, combined with the bank's documentation and tax notices, created a chain that could not easily be spun into the old story. What happened next unfolded faster than I had dared hope. The main LED behind the podium, which had been wreathed in the foundation's logo, flickered. The foundation's name disappeared, and for a beat that felt like it would stretch forever, the screen displayed something cold and official. The seal of a federal agency and a notice of asset seizure. The chatter in the room turned into a collective sucking sound, like a breath pulled sharply in. Men in suits moved through the crowd with the kind of purpose you expect in hospital code blues. Agents, DOJ, and IRS stepped forward with warrants and a plainness that made my father's practiced bluster look suddenly small and angry. They read a short set of orders and asked him to come with them. He protested, of course. In front of the microphone and the guests, he was suddenly a man with no script. The arrest was quick and crisp. No violent theater, no gory spectacle, just the mechanics of accountability. Hunter, my brother, had been in a VIP suite downstairs. When he learned, he reacted like a loose fuse. He shoved a waiter aside and barreled toward the agents, fists up and yelling about family and betrayal. For a moment I thought we would revert to old patterns, the physical fight that restores a small sense of tribal order. Luke moved between Hunter and the agents with a calm designed to hold hot things at bay. He is not large, but he has a way of putting himself where something soft needs protection, and he spoke in a voice that snapped the suite into order. Hunter was restrained by nearby security and later removed. The moment was frightening because it felt close to the past that taught me to make myself smaller for safety. It ended without blood because we were surrounded by trained people doing their job. After the arrest, the machinery of consequence turned slow and inexorable. Accounts were frozen. Federal auditors and investigators requested statements and copies. The Foundation's announcements were scrubbed from websites. There were subpoenas and later a plea negotiation that resolved some charges and left other matters for civil restitution. I am careful here because the law does not offer neat closure like a storybook. The cottage, which had been a symbol and a home, was put under temporary receivership, and then, after legal wrangling, assigned to a trust to be administered for community purposes and protection. The exact kind of stewardship my grandfather probably intended. There was a strange quiet afterward that lasted longer than any of us expected. People reached out with condolences and questions and opinions. Old neighbors shuffled in to see if the place I kept so private was still mine. I spent weeks fixing the cottage myself with a hammer and paint, doing small, useful work in the afternoons and night shifts at the hospital in the mornings. There is a dignity in repairing a porch board, in sanding and staining, in putting things right by hand. It felt like prayer, in a practical way I could understand. I did not become someone else with money. The trust did not turn me into a celebrity. It offered a buffer, and more importantly, a platform for turning the cottage into an actual place for respite, rooms for nurses who needed a weekend away, a small fund to pay for community health outreach, a scholarship in Samuel's name. I insisted on council administering the funds because the same systems that enforce justice can sometimes be manipulated by those who seek to make themselves wealthy. I wanted these assets to serve protection, not spectacle. People asked whether I felt triumphant standing as my father was led away. The honest answer is complicated. There was relief, yes, and a rigid satisfaction that the truth had teeth now. There was also sorrow, because power stripped from a person does not erase the harm they did, and because punishment does not stitch together years of petty violences that taught me to take up less space. I discovered in the months that followed that vindication is not an arrival. It is a work. The peculiarity of asserting one's right to be seen is that it requires continual small acts of visibility after the spotlight fades. I keep being a nurse. I keep answering the 3 a.m. call lights. I keep fixing what I can with my hands. There's a line I say to young patients who are frightened and feel powerless. We tend what we can. I took those words home to the cottage and to my life. The passbook, no longer a crumpled thing thrown into ice, sits in his safe that is part of a trust administered by independent counsel. It is a tool of protection, not a trophy. I do not parade it. Samuel had always been practical about his legacy. He wanted the things that mattered kept intact for people who would actually use them. The hardest part of the whole arc was recognizing that the person who taught me to be small was also capable of small kindnesses I'm still learning to give myself. The anger had its place. The plan we made had been necessary within the legal frameworks we used. But the real change came not from the arrest, but from the daily decisions, refusing to let an old script define my worth, showing up to work the morning after the gala, repairing a piece of wood with my own hands. If that sounds cold, understand that there is a kind of coldness you learn as a trauma nurse. A clarity that refuses theatrics in the face of life or death work. I channeled that clarity into procedures. Legal counsel filed the complaint, federal agents executed warrants, the bank preserved records. Those systems did the heavy lifting. Without them, my anger would have been a private furnace with no door. With them, it became something that could be directed at restoration. I didn't change my name or my job. People who thought I would vanquish my past by spending or flaunting found themselves disappointed because I chose restraint. Money for me became a means to an end, to create safe spaces, to fund care, to ensure Samuel's intention was honored by community service rather than family pageantry. I married the practical with the emotional, the cottage, the hospice fund, a small educational grant for trainee nurses from our county. Those are small things, but they are steady and hard to take away. When I go back to the bank now, the marble feels less like a courtroom and more like a threshold. The teller who first looked up at me as if startled by the figure in my hand is gone. She transferred branches. The branch manager sent an email that began with, "For what it's worth," and ended with, "Your courage." I do not think of myself as brave. We made choices, filed things properly with counsel, and the system did what it was designed to do. But I own the fact that I wanted to stop being invisible. There's an odd ritual I keep. Once a month I sit on the cottage porch with a cup of coffee and read Samuel's old notes, margins full of tiny, careful handwriting about who to call for seeds and when to prune the apple tree. I hold the passbook sometimes like one holds a map. It reminds me that legacy is not spectacle, it is responsibility. If you've ever been made small by someone who claimed to love you, you're not alone. There are legal tools and there are moral ones. They don't always line up neatly, but together they can form a shelter. My advice, if that word can apply to anything here, is not a blueprint for confrontation. It is a plea for prudence. Document what you can, seek counsel early, and consider who and what the money is meant to protect. What's the cruelest thing a family member ever did at one of your celebrations? Tell me below, if you feel like sharing. We tell stories to remind ourselves that we're not the only ones who have had to shout to be heard. I did not write this to gloat. I tell it because I think we deserve practical tenderness. The combination of law and community care that turns money from a weapon into shelter. In the end, I chose to be the same person I was before the passbook changed hands. A nurse who tends what she can, who steadies a hand in the dark, who keeps going back to the bedside. The cottage stands repaired, not as a monument to victory, but as a place where people can lodge when life falters. My father is accountable in a way he has never been before. My family is smaller and clearer about who will stand and who will step away. If a family secret ever cost you your voice, what would you do to get it back? If this story resonated with you in any way, consider subscribing. Come back tomorrow or next week, and we can sit with the quiet work of reclaiming what we were taught to lose.